It's my pleasure to welcome everyone back to the second panel of today, entitled The European Union, The View from 2019, in which we intend to think critically and shed some light on some of the key issues facing the European Union today, of which there are many, and against the backdrop of the historical discussion that we had in the last panel. So I'd like to just briefly introduce our speakers on this panel. I know you have their bios in your programs, but if you're like me, you may not have read them very closely or may have forgotten them. So I'd like to introduce them in the order in which they'll be presenting their 10-minute remarks. So first we have Professor Jiří Přibáň from Cardiff University, where he is professor of law. He was previously a professor at Charles University in Prague, his alma mater, and has held visiting positions in many places, including UC Berkeley and the European University Institute in Florence. He has focused his academic work in particular on questions of jurisprudence, legal philosophy, as they relate in particular to constitutionalism in Europe. Then we'll hear from Zuzana Gabrižová, who is the editor-in-chief of Euractiv Slovensko, which covers EU policies in a Slovak context. She's also the chairwoman of an NGO called Europolicy, which has a similar brief. She's a regular contributor to Slovak media and has also published academic papers on topics such as migration and the Slovak presidency of the EU. And then, third, we'll hear from Grzegorz, or Greg Lewicki, who's a fellow at the Polish Economics Institute, has his PhD in philosophy, history, and social sciences from Jagiellonian University. He's contributed a number of policy papers to the European Commission, Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and has focused his academic work in particular on trying to conceptualize the changes that the EU is undergoing, seeking historical precedents, maybe even lessons from the past. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jiří, and again, you have 10 minutes, and I will not be afraid to use these time warnings, so we have plenty of time then for discussion. So please.
Okay. Thank you very much, and first of all I want to express my thanks and gratitude to the organizers for putting all this together and for making me part of this event. And second, you probably noticed that I'm anxiously looking towards the door, and the reason why I was the last minute is that I left my computer at lunch, so I'm anxiously awaiting, hoping that it will come, with all my notes over there, but I won't be improvising, I will be simply recollecting my remarks. 1989-2019. It's 30 years since the changes that we call revolutions, that were more revolutionary in some countries, less revolutionary, more transitional or reform-oriented. Roundtable talks led in other countries, Poland and Hungary leading the way, and already building what was one of most important goals of the whole transformation or revolutions, the rule of law. And it's almost paradoxical to see that two leading countries that initiated roundtable talks, power transfer, recently, or in last decade, retreating from commitments and principles of democratic constitutionalism. However, I do not want to waste your time by yet another story about populism versus constitutionalism, democracy versus expertise. I'd rather focus on something else, and this is European imaginaries. In the 1990s, the European Union was fresh, new, and an amazing soft power because every country wanted to be member, and if not member, at least a candidate of membership. Yeah? This soft power of the European Union disappeared after, or has been disappearing, in the last decade, especially after the Eurozone crisis. And it's one of paradoxes of the European Union that what was to be perceived as the biggest achievement and guarantor against splits and wars, the currency, euro, actually has become a weapon of mass economic destruction in South. Yeah? So we in the European Union are living in an age which is not innocent anymore. 1990s was Europe in ascendancy. Apart from the imaginary of future federal Europe united by a constitution, currency, and guaranteeing no more wars, we are in a much more complicated territory now in 2019. Second, this is closely related to another imaginary which was very popular in the 1990s. Widening is deepening was a major slogan. So that I can see my computer is coming safely, but I can finish my presentation without it. This widening is deepening proved false again, because the candidate countries, Czech Republic including, became actually a source of new frictions. And these countries hugely benefited during the 1990s and the first decade, or the first years of this millennium. And yet, it was proved that widening didn't mean deepening, and that what happened in the European Union actually with enlargement created tensions in old countries, and in new countries it didn't always bring the improvement of democracy, rule of law, and economic situation. Although it is interesting that what is fascinating, an example of Poland, for instance, the country which is gradually, which didn't have economic recession in last 2 decades, still has weakening of constitutionalism and this backsliding of basic principles of European Union, because since the Amsterdam Treaty, the European Union is committed to democratic accountability of its member states, and despite democratic deficit, you cannot say that it's not a democratic community or commonwealth. And finally, deepening and widening is the second imaginary which didn't work. And the third imaginary which didn't work is right now, that we have this situation with Brexit. I'm sorry, I have to mention the B word here. And the imaginary of the European Union, or the adherents of the European Union, is that this is good, because the mess that Brexit has become is the best guarantor and against any future exits. And as I used to say, I had the strange privilege to represent two most Eurosceptic countries in one person, Czech Republic and the United Kingdom. Not anymore, only one member state, and it's. I think it's a big mistake. It's a wrong imaginary believing that European Union is threatened by exits. No, If Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic want to leave tomorrow, this is very easy. Okay, leave your credit card here, keys here, and have a nice day. Yeah? These countries hugely benefited in terms of democratic dividend, a better accountability of the executive power, the judiciary, all those programs of assistance in the 90s and around the millennium turn. It's something that is not always appreciated, but democratic deficits were perfectly neutralized by democratic dividend. Not anymore, because post-accession you have no conditionality, or you didn't have any conditionality, you have it only now. And it's a big failure of the European Union that it didn't challenge Viktor Orban's government early on, and it was complacent in tolerating what was building illiberal illiberal nation state, something which here I'm quoting from Viktor Orban. I'm not inventing any labeling here. And actually, European Union cannot but remain, make member states accountable. Member states cannot do anything they wish to do inside their countries. And here I'm not talking just about Central Eastern Europe, I'm talking also about Spain, for instance, and the questions that arise at member state level regarding democratic accountability and the protection of rights is a matter for us all. So, 30 years on, it is fascinating that European imaginaries are somehow exhausted. And so the imaginary of no more war, it never worked in Britain. Of course, we know it, because war, we won it. You are in rehab camp. Yeah, this is ever since the Zurich speech of Winston Churchill. The imaginary of deepening and widening is also controversial, because for instance, anti-migration feeling in this country is related profoundly to migration from Central Eastern Europe. And finally, democratic accountability and is also compromised. So how do we, what is the legacy of 1989? The legacy is pretty simple. These were revolutions which were lacking, fortunately, any utopian element. Unlike American utopia of declaration of independence, liberation from the empire, and building a republic, agrarian republic, basically those colonists building their dream, French Revolution quickly following, the Russian Revolution, including the Bolshevik Revolution, all these modern events were utopian events. 1989 was no utopia, utopia no more. Fortunately. Basically, we want to recreate what is happening, what is society in permanent crisis. Society in permanent crisis, and crisis is a problem, but Karl Popper used to say, life is problem solving. So, if there is any lesson from 1989, we entered the world of crisis, but we also earned the possibility of crisis resolution management. And in this respect, I have to go back to Ralph Dahrendorf, who said in 1989, yeah, it's a cliche now that was repeated endlessly, but that you can make a political reform in months, you can make economic reform in years, but civil society reform will take generations. Maybe we can turn it the other way around. You can have civil society built in years, and Slovakia is a good example of it, how you can have very strong civil society mobilization against authoritarian government. You can have economic reform which still takes, which will take generations. And I'm talking also about Eastern Germany, because what we heard in the first panel, you travel to East Germany today, and you can still tell the border between East and West. And the border is economic, but also cultural and political. But in terms of politics, it's fascinating, and we should relish the fact that we don't live in nation-state imaginaries of ethnos, topos, nomos anymore. Where we live is a supranational European polity governed by laws in which topos is not certain, is always contested, in which nomoi, laws, are generated by many different ways, and democracy and technocracy will be always struggling, but we mustn't give up to democracy, and we must hold European and national technocracy and bureaucracy accountable. And I always say to my Czech Eurosceptic friends, beware not bureaucrats from Brussels, beware bureaucrats from Czech Republic. And finally, when it comes to ethnos, I think it's a wonderful example that Europe, which created so many tragic horrors in modernity, which is responsible for modernity and its discontents, is finally making its constituent power beyond nationhood. And I here completely agree with what was said in the first panel, that our most important task is how we imagine nations, our nations, and our polities. And on Monday, I was just at a PhD defense in Geneva, at which a Slovak young scholar was successfully arguing how much depends on this symbolic legitimation, on this symbolic self-perception of who are we Slovaks, who are we Czechs, who are we Hungarians, and we always should beware anybody who will start counting and making inclusions and exclusions and speaking on behalf of these nations, and we should cherish the possibility of being Europeans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to really thank you for the opportunity to be here with such a distinguished colleagues and panelists, and for the opportunity to speak to a few remarks. I'd like to talk a little bit about or sketch out for you the relationship, complicated relationship that Slovakia has with the EU and how it evolved during the past 15 plus years. I divided it, it's sort of a simplification of course, but I divided it into several phases which also kind of function as a miniatures of the greater European debates. First of all, I think that the overall trajectory of Slovakia within the EU is interesting because, as you know, Slovakia was a laggard in the European accession process. In the words of Madeleine Albright, it was the black hole of Europe in the 90s. The political situation resulted in the fact that basically Slovakia was almost left out of the accession process compared to its colleagues in the Visegrad region. That being said, it is true that once the situation changed and Slovakia managed sort of the last minute to catch up with the process and become member in 2004, this also means that in Slovakia, probably a little bit more than in other countries of the Visegrad region, EU membership is kind of a synonym for setting the country firmly on the path of democracy and modernity. I think it's much more true than in other countries in the region. So from this situation, when I make this leap to the present, today Slovakia is one of the most integrated countries in the EU. Not only when comparing to the region, but overall, it takes part on basically every form of enhanced cooperation, every integration project there is in the EU, with the minor minor exemption from international cooperation on international divorce, not important. So how did we basically get here? There were several setbacks on this road, I would say. The first one, of course, was the Eurozone crisis. When basically many rescue mechanisms were adopted on the European level, that required also Slovakia to chip in, naturally. This was a moment of realization for many. Basically, it was the first time that many politicians, opinion makers, realized for the first time that the membership of Slovakia in the European Union and in the Eurozone has a price tag. That basically not only price tag, not only literally financially, but also politically. And it basically, for the first time, really there was this realization that how interdependent the EU and the Eurozone actually is. And the political price was very high for some. In 2011, the government of Gabrižová collapsed after only 1 year. What happened there that the Prime Minister basically tied the vote on the strengthening of one of the rescue mechanisms for Eurozone with a vote of confidence for her government, and she lost it. She lost it, and to these days she is referring to this moment with the terminology from Czech as a queen sacrifice. But what really happened? Mr. Fico came to government once again, and the Eurozone was basically safe because the adoption did take place in the end, and the Eurozone was saved for the time being, because the decision on which the Slovak government fell required a unanimity in the Eurozone at that time. Of course, the second setback on the road was the migration issue. I don't want to call it really a crisis, but migration issues. And first of all, the way how it was politically framed, not only in Slovakia, but also in the region. There were many discussions on, everybody had an opinion on what Mrs. Merkel should have done or shouldn't have done. And of course, migration issue as well as the crisis of Eurozone basically tested the understanding of solidarity in our countries in the region, because what it became clear that the understanding vastly differs here and in the West. And also this issue basically really strongly put the Visegrad group on the political map of the European Union, really, I mean, for the first time. Then in 2017, when the migration migration issue sort of calmed down politically, even if it of course wasn't resolved, there came this pro-European turn in Slovakia. It was the time when Slovakia just finished its first presidency of the European Council. And there were two factors that basically shaped this pro-European turn. One were, of course, internal. It was a political strategy of the governing parties to shift the focus from the domestic problems, which there were, of course, many, to isolate the opposition or part of the opposition at the time. And the external reasons for this shift that were, it was the time when in the European debate you could hear many discussion about the possible reform of the EU, possible strengthening of the multi-speed of integration, and of course the overall development in the Visegrad region also played a role in this turn. And when I speak about the pro-European turn, there was a specific narrative linked to that, and it basically went that even though Slovakia already is a member of the Eurozone, it basically aspires to be part of any future EU core that should something like that be established. And that is an aspiration that we have, and we are willing to pay. We are even willing to pay a price for that, be it more harmonization in social issues or even in taxation. At least that's something that was presented verbally. This, of course, differs or put Slovakia in a quite different course than Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic as well, which argue at a Visegrad format, but also on the European level, for an EU an EU that would much more listen to its member states, that will much more be prone to national governments as opposed to the old way of doing things, the communitarian principle, more or less. So basically, this was the setup vis-à-vis the EU when the events of last year struck. Of course, last year redrawn the political landscape in Slovakia quite to some extent. Of course, I'm talking about the murder of journalist Jan Kuciak and his fiancée, and all the events that followed after. It basically caused a political crisis that eventually resulted in a partial reconstruction of the government. Naturally, all of this narrative about being part of the EU core was pushed aside, but not only it was pushed aside, it was also perceived as being misplaced, really way off, because you were in the situation, according what we were witnessing, what information came forward after the murder, that the state basically is failing in very basic functions. There was never much of an discourse linked to the EU that was about values or principles, or like rule of law in Slovakia. And this is something that is supported by many surveys, opinion polls, that Slovakia politicians and the citizens alike have a very pragmatic relationship to the EU. They are very appreciative of the common market, of the freedom of movement, of course, common currency, the money transfers to some extent, well, to a large extent, because 80% of public investments in Slovakia are covered with the EU funds, which is an extraordinary number. But what happened in the aftermath of the unfortunate events, that you could hear the EU narrative linked with its principles and values, which was not the case before. And also, what I would say that we heard in the first panels about the EU being an environment where there is a natural interference between member states, and I would say that the intensified attention on Slovakia after the murder, and also political push or pressure from other EU countries. It really played into the political dynamics in those months, and I would say that it played for the better, even though it wasn't any structural dialogue or something that is happening with Poland and Hungary. But there was this pressure coming also from the European Parliament, and I think it helped even in practical terms, because there was this pressure for making Europol the part of the investigation team, and it really made a difference in the investigation. And it was also a time of a massive civic engagement, massive civic mobilization, probably the largest since 1989. So it was also a time of a massive media mobilization. So it was also the time when Slovak diaspora and Slovak living abroad were very vocal in saying what is happening in the country. And all in all, I think all of these dynamics somehow prepared the ground for the election of Zuzana Čaputová as a Slovak president just two weeks ago. And it will be very interesting to see how this will play out. Of course, there are huge expectations linked to her, which I think should be managed, because of course the powers of the president are very limited, and if she will make an impact, the impact will mostly be of a domestic nature. But what can happen as we have general elections next year, her success can somehow help those political platforms that were linked with her, and this is something that is already showing in some opinion polls. So if that should happen, I mean, Slovakia really needs to think about making its European and also foreign policy much more constructive and clear, because not to paint any kind of overly optimistic picture, there are serious problems in Slovakia because we are, for example, we are losing, or we already lost a long-term foreign policy consensus, and it's very visible vis-a-vis our eastern neighbor, Ukraine, Russian Federation, and of course, domestically, the extremist parties are gaining ground. Their support is going up. We saw it in the presidential election as well. And basically, if you combine the results of the candidates of the extreme, I would say, and anti-system, they more or less gain the same support as Mrs. Čaputová did, because as you know, the turnout in the second round was relatively low.
Okay, just try to stick to the timer. Turn on the timer. Let me start with what Dr. Přibáň said, that we are. The imaginaries of EU are currently, well, let's say, exhausted, and it's a great threat, because if you can't reimagine yourself, then you don't know where you're heading. And this is actually my first point I wanted to make, so that we are really lacking a language to describe the ongoing process of transformation of the European Union, not only political, not only cultural, but also civilizational. And I think it's, for all of you gathered here, also those who are dealing with European studies, it's a great, let's say, historical momentum that we don't have the terms to speak of what is happening in Europe. And why is that so, in my opinion? Well, the main culprit, let's say, if I was to give a label, would be, say, postmodernity. Right. Because we no longer refer to some cultural, civilizational processes in those low Brodelian terms of, processes that last centuries. We're all about the mid-term, short-term processes. We don't speak about some things because of political correctness. To give you an example, in the last decades, you could not say anything about, for example, Muslim, Arab, Lebanese crime networks in Germany because it was racist. You don't say about such things. So then you suppress some issue, and then it returns in pop culture. If any one of you saw this movie series called 4 Blocks, about the Muslim community in Germany, how it functions, how it operates. The intelligence officers of Germany are really rolling their eyes right now, because they're claiming this movie series is actually encouraging crime-related behavior, and they cannot do anything because it's already a pop culture. The third thing that causes this lack of language is just lack of interest. We are all a post-historical, bubble in a historical greenhouse. We take peace for granted. So to work out, to create this kind of new vocabulary to speak about what's happening, we should really focus on the shape of things to come. I do work on such kind of vocabulary. I'm taking some bits of scraps from Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian, a bit outdated, from Hadley Boo, a British social and political scientist. And one of the theses, my thesis about the current things happening in Europe is that Europe largely resembles Roman Empire in the period of Pax Romana. Mind you, it's not this kind of right-wing bubbling, apocalyptic bubbling that, oh, wow, Rome, okay, we have to fall. No. I mean, a Pax Roman period in the history of Rome lasted for 200 years, and I would love to see EU flourish for the next 200 years. I'm from the country that has the greatest percentage of pro-EU attitude, like 80% of, 70-80% of Poles are pro-EU. It's the greatest number in Europe currently. So, returning back to this Roman Empire stuff. So, Arnold Toynbee, the Oxford historian, claimed that periodically in the history of nations there emerge something he called universal state. So, what are its features? It has a post-war genesis. It creates a philosophy of tolerance. It establishes a form of multiculturalism, and it's undergoing such specified ethnic dynamics and religious dynamics. Doesn't matter. What matters here is that EU is or seems to be this kind of political organism. It has a post-war genesis, of course, after the Second World War. It worked out this postmodern philosophy of tolerance that kind of justifies its lasting. It established its own, version of multiculturalism. So, first, if you create this kind of metaphor, then we can kind of enlighten things to come. Because I'm a foresight consultant, so I kind of double in things that the trends or things that are about to happen. So, without this broader scale of reference, we won't see the things that are coming. But okay, leave this aside because we are talking about 1989 and what's happening right now. So. There is this Harvard scholar called Avi Tucker. He really wrote a great book on what's happening in Eastern Europe called The Legacies of Totalitarianism, a very nice book that basically claims that the whole Eastern Europe underwent similar developmental processes because they have this kind of common post-communist ancestry. The result, in short, is various types of backwardness. First of all, economic backwardness, technological backwardness, and so on. But important thing to note is that some kinds of backwardness, and it's happening right now, might change into advantages. So, Ian Morris, the author of Measuring Civilization book, a Stanford scholar, uses the term advantage of backwardness. So, because of changing the system of international relation is changing, so the qualities of the nation changes. So let's look at Poland, for example. We have joined the EU. So we already joined Pax Europiana, a great expanding area of peace. We are currently experiencing the longest period of peace in Polish history. We were a periphery of globalization that joined in this kind of developing structure. So it occurred during the economic crisis that it's actually an advantage because the surge, the impact of the crisis did not influence Poland that much. To the contrary, in November this year, 2019, Poland will be, according to economic indices, will be richer than Portugal, and soon it will take over Spain and Hungary. Throughout the Polish history, if you take a history of Poland from Middle Ages, we as a country never had more than the average GDP of Western Europe. We never had more than 55% of Western European GDP. By 2050, if there won't be war, you're just moving your head. The data comes from Europe Growth Champion, the book by Marcin Pionkowski, the World Bank expert.
Germany after 30 years war was a disaster.
Well, okay, but I'm just speaking about the average. Oh Jesus, 2 minutes. Okay. And the third advantage of backwardness is the fact that we joined later all of these European processes. So, for example, when we are now working as Poland on the processes related to migration, the migration-related policy, integration-related policy, we can, first of all, learn from the failures of the Western Europe. We can learn from the tenets of intercultural psychology, a branch of psychology, an emerging branch of psychology that tries to measure stuff like cultural distance, cultural affinities, and so on. So we can actually, we can use this kind of backwardness to our advantage as a region. And how? Okay, you're asking how. So, for example, not many people know that Poland has this undiscovered tradition of tolerance and multiculturalism. I'll give you the picture of the Battle of Tannenberg, 1410. So you had two clashing armies. On the one hand, you had the Teutonic Order, who were more papal than the very Pope in their beheading, Lithuanian pagans. On the other hand, you had an army of King Jagiello, and in this army you had Muslims, you had pagans, you had Roman Christians, you had Orthodox Christians, and these armies clashed, and the Polish side won. And so when I went recently, when I was in Germany, some people asked me, okay, so how did you integrate all of these different ethnicities and nationalities in Poland? And I gave them an example of the Polish Muslims, Polish Tatars who are living in Poland. So in terms of Tatars, we were integrating the Muslims, but they had to, in the Jagiellonian era, they had to accept one thing, only one simple algorithm. In any case, when Quranic traditions, just give me a few, dismiss. In any case, when the Quranic traditions say something that is contrary to your host culture, you would follow host culture. Then look at what's happening today in France. When President Macron wanted to start a process called by the media structuration of Islam, there was a backslash from the left because they thought, no, you're mixing into religious affairs, get lost. The Muslim community said, no, we cannot say Sharia will be always, above the French national state. So when you go to the Turkish areas, some Turkish areas in Germany, there's a similar problem. So before you start to picture Poland as this kind of anti-immigration, anti-integration country, just you should know that we integrated minorities, and we can have impact on Europe with these kind of traditions. But these kind of traditions really had to be implemented from down to top. If Macron says, okay, top to down, I want you to really follow my rules, then the community says, no, when we were coming here, no one actually asked us to follow these rules. I'm finishing. Just to finish this with raw data. With my colleagues, I created something which is called State Power Index. It measures the power of the countries economically, military-wise, culturally, and so on and so on. And we have counted that a more integrated EU would be the most powerful country in the world. It would outsmart China, it would outsmart US, but so far it's only a power on paper. If from my, let's say, foresight analysis, there's a conclusion that if we want kind of win Europe, Europe as a coherent union of nations, with new social imaginaries, with new approach to reality, we will really transform in a cauldron replete with riots, replete with political separatism, lots of segregation, religious, both right-wing and left-wing radicalisms clashing with each other. And I think it's the last this kind of middle way between the radical right, between the radical left, including both sides. It's a kind of path, the only stable pathway, in game theoretic terms, the only possible pathway to the future.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all three of our speakers for these incisive and refreshing comments from very different angles on where we stand in 2019 vis-a-vis this, in many ways, unprecedented polity experiment, the European Union. And I think the panelists have shed light on a number of things that we can take up in our discussion. They have also raised, I think, explicitly and implicitly some important questions. For example, the question of sort of the civilizational value of the European Union, if there is any, what East Central Europe, what the Visegrad countries contribute to any kind of civilizational identity or to the commitment to the rule of law, basically the European Union's broader identity. And I think it was very interesting that Jiří also brought up this question of utopia, which we had in the first panel, which is not only no place, but is also a happy place. And the word was intended as a kind of double meaning from the start. And so that's important to keep in mind. And you said that the 1989 transition or revolution lacked that utopian element largely. And I can't remember if you said fortunately or unfortunately.
I said fortunately.
Fortunately, yes. Yeah. So I think that's an important question too, whether that is fortunate for the long-term prospects of the European Union. I mean, perhaps it is the kind of non-utopian element that gets people out on the streets, as in the case of Slovakia. I mean, defense of the rule of law is a sort of non-utopian element in some ways. So I think that's something that we have to consider quite carefully when thinking about the EU today, and maybe have different approaches, different mental frameworks, different discourses than when thinking about other sort of major political transformations in the modern world. So I'd like to just open it up now to discussion.
Thanks. Thanks, another great panel. My question immediately responds to the last presentation, but it's broad enough I'd be happy to hear what any or all of the panelists think about it. And it comes to the question of backwardness. This is the fourth of these symposia, and I was involved in organizing the first three. And the first one was 8 or 9 years ago. And at that point, it was very much still under the sort of paradigm of post-communist economies, to some degree societies, and this idea of kind of a process of catching up with Western Europe and the United States. And over the course of those first three symposia, gradually we moved away from that sort of framework and tried to think of other ways of pitching the question of sort of East Central Europe within Europe as a whole. And what, really strikes me now is that in some ways, the way that East Central Europe was described as in some sense backwards 8, 9, 10 years ago, a hangover of post-communist society, all these sort of various archaic impulses that would come under control. It wasn't behind, they were ahead of the scene. In many ways, that was anticipating something that has now taken hold on the highest levels in the United States and to some degree all throughout Europe. So basically, my question is whether it is helpful, if you think it's helpful, to think that one of the main characteristics and one of the main challenges of the present moment is that the very idea of backwardness or this kind of comparative timeline or progressive framework is no longer useful. And we've sort of moved beyond it to fall back into it.
Yeah. I mean, to an extent, yes. I mean, I'm a really a great follower of comparative perspective in general. But I understand what you mean, that as the economic social level of the East is going upwards, then these categories, the analytic categories that analyze the East, are becoming less useful. But on the other hand, for example, if you take the 3Cs initiative, the initiative of the technological, infrastructural, and logistic enhancement of the eastern wall of the EU, including Poland, Croatia, and all these countries, they are all playing on this backwardness. So if they weren't backwards in terms of technology, roadworks, railways, and so on, the project would never be triggered. Another thing, the very idea that we are mentioning at the beginning, the rule of law, right? The rule of law problems in Eastern Europe. If you take Avi Tucker's book called Legacies of Totalitarianism, he's showing that really literally all countries of the post-communist bloc were suffering from something that he called rough justice. Rough justice is this kind of system of justice that emerges as a result of former communist class trying to reshape their capabilities into democratic obligations, so leaving a country vulnerable to misusing or abusing the juridical system. And in case of Poland, when I checked how it looked like in Poland, so in the very 90s, when we were a candidate to NATO and EU as Poland, everyone saw that our judicial system is bad, but we were so much into entering the EU that we were really cautious not to touch judicial system because the East is doubling in judicial system. It may be labeled as undemocratic. So if many our key politicians who are responsible for that, they would say no, they knew this is bad, but it's a backwardness because we are being compared all the time by our own politicians to the West. So, for example, our government, our ministers, they're saying, okay, by, let's say, 2050, according to the prognosis by European Commission, we will have 80% of the GDP of the Western Europe. And the Poles want to be like that. So I think this comparative perspective cannot vanish. It's useful because then it creates a kind of an imaginary, a community. Well, if the economic level is on the same level, then okay, we leave this tool aside, but we take another tool, right? And we project this onto our future.
Okay, if I may just maybe two remarks on that. On the notion of catching up, I would say, speaking for Slovakia, it's still pretty much present in the political discourse in Slovakia. Catching up in a sense of materialistic economic sense. There you would still have politicians that would say that the slow pace of convergence in salaries and other indicators that people really do care much was some kind of a failure of the EU to deliver for the past 15 years. That is, of course, connected to what I mentioned, that the discourse about the EU in Slovakia was very materialistic and it still is to these days. So it is for a cohort of people a source of Euroscepticism, so to say. So it is domestically still relevant. When it comes to backwardness, I think it's always open to broad interpretation what we can imagine under the term, but I think it's a fact, again, supported by many surveys and analysis that people in West and East do have different perceptions when it comes to embracing minorities, when it comes to religion, when it comes to cultural issues like gay marriages, abortion, and so on and so forth. And to my mind, there is a kind of a deep split within Slovak societies on the issue whether we should somehow overcome this difference in the way how we look at things and look at the world. Or there is another quite a large number of people who would say no, we should embrace that because it's something that forms part of our identity and makes us unique, and we should, on the contrary, somehow try to persuade the countries in the West that this is much more healthy way to look at the world. And the polarization stemming out from these issues, cultural and ethical, is really deep in Slovakia.
Thank you very much for the question, and maybe I can link it somehow to Jakub's early comments and the question of utopia. You can speak about backwardness and backward and forward only if you know where you're going. And postmodernity, as we, it always reminds me my favorite Talking Heads band song. We are on the road to nowhere. Yeah? So where are we? Which going? But of course, I guess you meant the feeling of backwardness. This what we in Central Europe beautifully call Minderwertigkeitskomplex. And it's interesting that it's a European, it's shared complex in Europe, because Italians have complex of inferiority because they cannot govern their country. Germans have their complex of inferiority because they believe in Vorsprung durch Technik and look at their tragic politics, political history. British have their sense of inferiority because they don't have the levels of sophistication that is there in France, and after all, Napoleon perhaps was right that they are the nation of shopkeepers, yeah? And so on and so on. And so we shouldn't stereotype Central Eastern Europe in terms of backward, forward, but about this collective feeling. But what you ask about is very important in terms of post-89 developments. And here, utopia, I was saying, well, fortunately we didn't have utopian notion, revolutionary utopia, because it was much more about learning processes, assistance during the accession. We learned a lot from the old member states, the old European Union, about governance, about accountability, and clearly, in this sense, there's nothing to be ashamed of, and Central East European countries made and had an amazing opportunity. Some of it was wasted, and here I didn't have a chance to mention one imaginary which is dying out, which is imaginary of the Visegrad countries as countries who are moving fast and returning to Europe. Today they want to lecture Europe in the worst, most vulgar possible way, in the spirit of what we in Czech call Chytrý Honza fairy tale character. We feel that we can lecture the rest of Europe on how it should be doing its business. In fact, it is pathetic. So in that sense, learning, we should have taken learning experience more seriously.
We have three hands on this side of the room. Maybe we could do take a round of questions and then have the panelists respond. So here, here, and here.
One sort of comment. I think, well, first of all, I would like to speak about Europe, not about Poland, but I have to say something on both. Namely, when we talk about Europe as a community of values, and then we see Franz Timmermans, who come to Poland these days to support Leszek Miller, who is one of the leaders of opposition today, and he was the first leader of the post-communist party when the communists started to call themselves social democrats. And one of his first acts was to take money from KGB in order to sustain the communist daily newspaper that was dying. And now he's supported for the sake of the European values by the Vice President of the European Commission. It's not adding credibility to Miller, but it is taking out credibility from the European institutions. This kind of misunderstanding cannot be then presented as activity to support European values and democracy. This is the first remark. The second one is, please remember that the European Union has three symbols. Two of them are known, the third one is forgotten. I mean, everybody knows the flag, everybody knows the anthem, but there is as well the devise, that means concordia in diversity. I mean, that we should respect the fact that we are different. This is something that, in fact, should be treated seriously. Another thing about the rule of law. Please remember that the beauty of the European Union, the fact that it is really a tremendous achievement, is that natural competition and natural, maybe not contradictions, but at least the differences in what is priority to this or that nation is decided at the negotiation table and not at the battlefield. And it is a great achievement. But don't pretend that there are no differences, and that is the game based on the rule of law. No, it isn't. In 1997, there was the Treaty of Stability and Progress with the rules of budgetary discipline, and that budgetary discipline was violated by Germany, France, and Italy in the first decade of this century, and they were strong enough in European Union Council to vote that it is extraordinary situation and they should not be subjected to the treaty procedures. When there was a crisis, financial crisis in Ireland, the Irish budget was presented to the European Commission, but then it was debated by the Budgetary Commission of Bundestag. Why? Now, when it was made public information, there was a great scandal in Ireland because Irish budget was debated in German Parliament before being debated in Irish Parliament. It's the rule of law? No. Now, when France is indebted over all the European rules, it is not a subject of the European procedures because, as Juncker says, it's France. There is no other explanation. Italy are subjected, France is not. Why? Because it's France. And so on. We can speak about Nord Stream 2 and the exclusion from the European law that was pushed through by Germany against the third energy package. Is trade with gas with Russia a European value? No, it isn't. It's just the game of the interests. So when we speak about European Union as a desirable unity that should be based on some rational rules, I think first of all, the first rule is to stick to reality. We are all Europeans, but we are Europeans in a cultural sense, not that much in the Europeans in the political sense. Because in a political sense, you can declare that we will have European army, but then imagine the Prime Minister of Finland that is coming back to Helsinki and is announcing to his people that they should send troops to Mali because they were overvoted in the European Union. If we achieve this level of integration, which is not the case now, of course. And then you have to win the elections. And that image of situation and the readiness to sacrifice these or that things for this or that goal is different in different countries. And we have to take it into consideration. The best example is Britain. You can achieve the agreement in Brussels, but then you have to come back to London and achieve the agreement of your parliament to ratify the agreement. And this is the case all over Europe. Slovakia survived 3 governmental crises because Slovakia participated in the program to save Greece, while Greece is richer than Slovakia.
Not Greece, but the other ones, yes.
So there is a price to be paid, and we have, in order to be effective, in order to be united, in order for the European Union to survive, we have to take into consideration the fact that we are all democracies, whether we are small or large. And even in the smallest country, if you ignore the public opinion, well, again, Slovaks, you have euro and you have this reverse coin with Cyril and Method.
Right.
And there was a great scandal because the European Commission said that no Christian symbols because it's a laic organization.
It was
So
French
it's
who
like
said
to
it.
say to Irish people, you can celebrate Patrick Day, but not St. Patrick Day. You cannot do these things to the people unless you want to provoke a real rebellion. Please remember about diversity. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering, what does the UK mean to Visegrad to contextualize it? Here we are in London, we're speaking in English. You make a lot of talk about the imaginary. So thinking, what is the UK relation to Visegrad? And by comparison with the imaginary with Germany? How does that compare with the imaginary versus Germany and the relation in that terms, and also with Russia as well? But not just in the imaginary, there's been a mention of how Europe could have this great future. It could be intellectually, culturally, a great bloc that could do so much and be as powerful as China or more powerful than America. What is UK's role in maybe affecting this potential, if that's the right way of putting it? Thank you.
Thanks. And one more before we get responses. Right behind you.
Actually, apparently, somebody once asked Mahatma Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? And his response was, it's a very good idea. In other words, he spoke ironically. Should we say that about the EU? It's a very good idea. And if it's just not a good idea, what's wrong with it? Look, some people celebrate diversity, whatever that may mean. And many people applaud the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1989 onwards. So, 2019, some people have observed, scholars and journalists, that the EU is collapsing. Why aren't we applauding? Maybe in 2049, the United States will collapse. Apparently, California has already asked to secede from Trump's America. So maybe it's a good thing that people want to secede. At the root of these secessionist movements is the concept of sovereignty, especially in Britain. I wonder if the panelists would like to comment on that. I mean, I'm not going to assume that you are Remainers, that you're against Brexit or against exit. But I'm looking for ammunition to argue against people who want to exit. And I've noticed that many of them suggest that the ultimate reason they want to exit is, especially in Britain, or from the EU, people in Britain, the Brexiteers, they argue that Britain is losing its sovereignty. I suspect you'll hear the same thing in France, in Italy, in Hungary, in Poland, and especially in Greece. So I'd like you to comment on that. In other words, I'm looking for ammunition. What can I say to people who say, we want to leave the EU because, I forgot to mention Germany. We want to leave the EU because we are afraid our country is losing its sovereignty.
Thank you. Yes, maybe we could get responses from the panelists before we take another round, starting here and then over here. Maybe each of you could respond once to one or more of the comments and questions that have been raised, okay?
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. And I will go in the opposite direction of the questions. And my great friend and highly respected colleague and one of the greatest legal philosophers of the last century, late Neil McCormick, wrote a famous sentence: sovereignty is not like virginity. It's not something that if you lose it, you can never reclaim it, okay? And it's so simply put, and sovereignty is an instrument. How you run things at home and abroad. external, internal sovereignty, Britain, and this goes also to the imaginary of Britain, Britain is a unique country which doesn't speak about popular sovereignty. Sovereignty of the people, unlike in France, unlike in other countries of the continental Europe, here we have parliamentary sovereignty. And Brexit is a wonderful example, it's an example of when direct and representative democracy clash. Yeah? And now Parliament, that is sovereign, tries to make some sense, some exit out of it. Yeah? And so sovereignty is an instrumental thing which you can pull, and Germans, they have a word for everything, so Schadenfreude and Minderwertigkeitskomplex, but also geteilte Souveränität in German means both pooled sovereignty, that you pull it together, and divided sovereignty. And this pooled and divided is something which works at European level, and we know that each country limits its sovereignty, but it is also to the benefit of its own exercise of policies, internal policies. So in that sense, this would be my response. Yeah, you lose something, you gain something, but isn't it that you would lose more if you want to get this imaginary sovereignty as virginity? Yeah, and you might end up with financial scams on Virgin Islands. Yeah, and it's we know what we're talking about. Britain as the greatest exporter of the world corruption of finance capital, which brings me to this imaginary of UK. I will be now nice, yeah, because I think especially in Central Europe we feel a great loss. Because Britain was very important in terms of imaginary of, unlike despotic French state, unlike the racially racist, the Nazi legacy of Germany, Britain has many things to shame about, but it also has many things to offer. Yeah? Not just parliamentary democracy, but certain notion of civility which was always relished by continental thinkers. And so we're losing a lot when we lose Britain as symbolic imaginary, which is and is going to be part of Europe. And we are asking why. And in this sense, why couldn't you accommodate more into this? Future Europe will be differentiated integration anyway. We didn't speak about future imaginaries of Europe, and I think that it will be ever more differentiated integration. And UK was also important for policy making. It was a great ally of smaller countries in Central Europe when they had to pool powers against German, French engine of the European Union. And finally, if I can finish on this note that, yeah, Europe of values, Europe, we are all Europeans. Well, I'm always scared when politicians start talking about values. And I say that values are high moral explosive. Yeah? So when Viktor Orban talks about values, and Angela Merkel talks about values, and Emmanuel Macron talk about values, they all talk about values. I said, well, I would like to isolate them somewhere which would be safe for the rest of us. So definitely much less cultural politics, identity politics, a lot more political pragmatism, doing first things first, small things may be much more important than big things. And in that sense, I think the loss of British pragmatism, but what is British pragmatism today anyway?
Okay, if I may, maybe building on Brexit, for Central Europe, that's definitely a loss, because we do remember that it was Great Britain that was a strong advocate of the enlargement in 2004. And yes, it was also an ally in many European policies that goes mostly unnoticed among general public, but it was the case, especially on regulating the European single market, where the position of Great Britain and certainly Slovakia, also probably other countries in the Visegrad region, as a vision of a more liberal way to rule the market. Of course, now Britain leaving, that also leaves us, the EU as such, with less money to redistribute, and that makes Slovakia at least a little bit anxious how that will play out budget-wise. But Brexit as such, we have this basically neo-Nazi, neo-fascist party in Slovakia that is gaining ground, and they were collecting signatures for calling a referendum on Slovakia exiting from the EU, but basically also under the what we saw it was happening with Great Britain, with all the Brexit procedures and how it's not so far working out, then they silently dropped this endeavor, and now they say they are not for an immediate exit of Slovakia from the EU, and they are even campaigning in the European elections very vividly. Just maybe a few remarks on maybe on Franz Timmermans. I think he was doing relatively good job in what he was supposed to do, but I do agree that once he stepped into the election campaign as the Spitzenkandidat of the Party of European Socialists, he should step down, or he should at least recluse himself from the sensitive issues with Poland or Hungary. I would definitely prefer that, because it's somehow spoiled the system. You mentioned also Nord Stream 2. It's also valid in Slovakia as an argument that somehow decreases the legitimacy also of Germany as in some respect, and also creates this impression of double standards in the EU, which is something very toxic that is playing out very wrongly in the region. It is not only Nord Stream 2, but is also the issue of double food standards, so to say. It's of course not a fault of the EU. Actually, it's other way around. That the EU actually provides us with the tools to actually tackle this issue. And the third one is, you may know, Austria adopted a law that basically introduces the indexation of child benefits to workers from other countries. So the child benefits will be put on the level that a worker would receive in their home country. So basically for Slovak workers, it's mostly women who go work in Austria in caring sector. So they will basically get much lower child benefits. This is something that Slovakia is contesting, and it's somehow counting on the European Commission that it will put pressure and possibly even put it on the Court of Justice that Austria will change the law. So this is also something that creates this feeling of double standards, because it's, so far it's not settled.
Okay. Professor Přibáň was saying UK was in EU. I'm saying UK is EU, because it you know, as far as I know, it has been prolonged till October. So you know, many things can still happen, and democracy is a dynamic system. And when I ask people from the you know, London financial elites about the Brexit, there are no Brexiteers among them. The social profile of a person who was supporting Brexit is, well, largely similar to the people who are responsible for the yellow vest crisis in France. So middle class that is not living in the hubs of globalization, that well, I'll give you a quote. My friend from Scotland told me, you know, I don't care whether I will take another risk on my back, for example, pound, you know, losing its worth, because we are all skinned anyway. I mean, we're so poor, we're a precariat, so we basically don't care about things that happen in this faraway Brussels. So, but why I'm saying this, because Brexit, in terms of foresight scenarios, may lead to great tragedies, including the fragmentation of the country. In Scotland, you have people who are really seriously claiming, okay, we can leave UK and then return to the EU. Can you imagine the problem with the Irish border? It will still cause problems that will last long years to come. And as one of you probably correctly guessed, I'm pro-EU, I'm anti-Brexit. Well, I criticized some processes like multiculturalism, too much bureaucracy within the EU. But in order to bring more sanity, to the system, what could be, the role of the UK and your question, role of the UK with, in relation to Visegrad countries? A month before the referendum, or 2 months, I don't remember exactly. Our Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs declared, Britain to be a, strategic partner of Poland. So they are. And I cannot imagine how he did this. That a few months after, wow, the clash we are living. But this leads me to the question you asked: how to explain to the people the things. The good term would be the difference between classical state and network state. I mean, in traditional sovereignty was just a state, a very much independent state, entering bilateral relations with the other countries. It's just not the reality anymore. When we think of state and their relations, it's all about networking. Network state is a state that enhances its own standing through the network relations. And one example was that the possible alliance of Poland and UK. I mean. In Poland, we were really admiring UK as this kind of country that has common sense, feeling of civility, great pragmatism. That's why, we will be weakened as a country as well because of Brexit. But returning to my narrative, in the network state logics, you generate scale effects. What it means, you can act, or you can have your influence on international reality thanks to the others. So the dynamics of alliances within the EU, everyone who has visited Brussels, everyone who was sitting in some chambers of EU administration can tell you that it's all about the processes that are bubbling and enhancing one another. So if UK leaves that, it won't receive, because this is what the Brexiteers are frequently telling. We can be this kind of Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, of Europe. So we will be this kind of, a cradle of economic liberalism. But you won't, because France and Germany won't allow this, because you were the third most powerful country in the EU. So the logics of small countries like Liechtenstein, that is benefiting from cultural affinity both to Germany and France, that has this kind of special status, it won't be transferable onto the UK after Brexit. But in my understanding, the UK is depriving itself of networks of influence. It can, then sign in the trade agreements, but it won't be as powerful as it would be, within the EU. So, I think this is the way. This kind of narrative of collective strategies is a way to kind of probably translate these things to people who are pro-Brexit, but they don't care. I mean, they don't care, because it's if you go to people who support yellow vests in France, and you say, okay, but you are disrupting the stability of your country. I say, well, so, the price of gas makes my life unbearable, and people who are pro-Brexit, they because of the failure, I think, of UK elites who did not. I mean, I was follow, because I'm commenting frequently in the media about UK affairs in Poland, and the narrative, the prevalent narrative of speaking of EU in UK was always, okay, EU is like an, you know, like lesser evil, you know, like the conservatives especially. So, and the common man says, the precariat says, okay, so if I have to choose between lesser evil and bigger evil, so I will choose bigger evil because maybe opportunity out there is such that I will gain more in the future. So yeah, so that's the main problem.
Thank you. Time for another round, starting over here.
Just after you, yeah. I feel I am more active and dynamic if I'm standing, and I think it's a sign of respect to the people. Having studied here at UCL years ago, I feel at home. But because of that, because of my profession, being a lawyer and studied not EU but EC law, when they were 12 countries, as much as the number of stars on the flag, I feel out of place here. Why? Because I come from Kosovo, and as much I would want, because of my background studies and everything, to legalize or philosophize, like political philosophy on the subjects and issues that you, dear colleague, have mentioned, and I would love that, but this contradicts to the situation back home, and my folks back home would not bear a value, will not get a value of what we are discussing here today. And I was sort of laughing with myself, hang on, maybe somebody should have asked me before getting in here because I don't belong to the club. Of course, this is sort of metaphorically speaking, but I would now pose a question to the panel, which I think they would know, but to the rest of you as well. Who from you does need a visa, I'm talking within European Union and European countries, to travel to Brussels from their home country? Anyone? I don't think so. Kosovars are the last people, last group of citizens that have been isolated, and I'm not being emotional or whatever, unjustly isolated. And mind you, we were talking about the other session about East and Western Bloc. Yugoslavia was sort of in the middle. But we never had visas. We traveled in 60s, 70s, 80s, to Russia, probably to Beijing, let alone like Paris, London. There were no visas for Yugoslav citizens. Now, we have been brought, sort of, using your word, backwardness, we have been taken backward like 3 centuries, three decades. And I feel like a group of people traveling, and Kosovars were left out of the line back in the desert. Mind you, I am here organizing an event, a book launch for a publisher. He is well known, he travels to US and everywhere else, but says, I have no visa, I cannot come. So my question to you is, broadly, generally to the enlargement and everything, I am convinced, it's my personal view, of course, what I'm talking, that there has been injustice among the candidates and the way they were treated towards EU, and it was not done on the merits. That's one thing that has nothing to do with us, but generally speaking. And for political reasons, geostrategy and everything, which we do understand. But coming to visa liberalization and Schengen club, I think there was no reason, and there is no reason. And even more so, having Kosovo fulfilled all the criteria, and EU Commission stating that, yes, guys, you have fulfilled it, and EU Parliament staying for the second time, stating that, yes, they have fulfilled, please allow these folks to travel. So the situation back in the capital in Pristina is this. You see young students, young people lined up before German embassy, French embassy, asking for a visa to go to study. Or, such as my brother, waiting for job interview in Berlin, but he cannot go. So if EU wants to have an impact, and by the way, you mentioned, I think, that Poland is like 80%, or you call it 80%. Kosovo is 95% pro-EU, but we're outside. And we have many times stated that this is our only path, which is maybe wrong, but that's the truth. We say, this is only path. We were in EU, we are like mentally, geographically, and we want to become part of it as a political entity. So I would ask you, is there anything that can be done, or how do you feel having left somebody who has never had visa to EU, before EU being in existence, now they cannot even travel for like PhD studies or students, whatever. And the thing is that this would have been a nice way of impacting young generation, and the trust, this is very important, the trust has been damaged. Not among the Kosovars in general, but young generation towards EU, having fulfilled criteria, having been told that you will get free travel, and not having got it. Thank you very much.
I just want to ask you, like, do you think the exit of Britain represents a failure of the idea, like the utopian idea of multiculturalism in Europe? Because it's multiculturalism what the right-farm movements are using to like pump these ideas in society to go backwards in time, where maybe like these different countries feel like their identities are left behind, but they're actually not they're not actually like losing control of them because they have control of them, but it's like more lead to the political idea of it. So yeah, do you think like the far right movements are using multiculturalism as a way to raise?
There's, I think, one more question, 2 rows back.
Sorry. Okay. Leaving the problematic notion of backwardness aside for a moment, I think one of the central questions in this debate is whether Central and Eastern European member states of the EU have found a way of articulating specifically Eastern problems and vulnerabilities in the jargon of EU central institutions. One of you, I think that was Ms. Gabrižová, mentioned the problem of dual food quality. Yes, sure, we have witnessed some initiatives from the side of European Commission, except that they are a result of a long battle, and it's not the case that they are solving the problem efficiently, because there is still this avenue that can be used by food producers, i.e. that they can simply use a different brand on Eastern market, and that brand can still be of inferior quality. Another area in which this problem of specifically, in which we witness that some problems in EU politics are specifically Eastern, is the directive on posted workers, where basically I don't think that the Western commentariat has managed to grasp that, for example, Polish transport companies would be affected the most. It's very much the case that they should just eat it up and embrace the new directive for the sake of social Europe. But there is no such thing as a united social Europe, because, as Professor Přibáň has rightfully mentioned, widening has not led to deepening. So is there a language for articulating Eastern European problems, is my question. Thank you.
Very quickly.
Just very quick question. Sorry. Yes. Moving from problems to benefits, because there's been talking about learning for Eastern European countries after the collapse of communism, also how Brits, other nations could learn from their pragmatism. The question for me is, what do you think has been the positive contributions since 1989 or 2004 of the former Eastern Bloc to the European discourse or the Western discourse? What has actually changed, that added value coming from that, formerly communist bloc, the second lung of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe generally?
Okay. Final words from the panelists. No more than 3 minutes each. Maybe start from that end. See here.
Well, as to Kosovo, the story is that there's a great debate on furthering, because in the nature of EU there's an expansion. But I think I'm not an expert on Kosovo. I think we'll have like fabulous speakers in the following panel, so they will probably tell more about this. So sorry, I just cannot. I'm not. Well, I know my stuff, but I know where, and I don't know the answer. Another thing, does Brexit represent a failure of multiculturalism? Well, it basically represents the failure of the elites to perceive the logics of globalization, especially economic globalization, because the Brits who I read some reports about the profile of Brexit voters. Primarily, they are not against. They're against something that transcends them. They are not against, they just don't have enough info about the EU, so they just cannot basically realize how this is changing their life. They're just blaming the EU as a structure. This is related to another question about the use of the right-wing politicians, the use of multiculturalism as this kind of whipping. Yes, it's precisely the case. Mind you. I'll tell you the story. When I participate in this kind of panels, my stance is that I'm critical towards the modern version of multiculturalism, but not multiculturalism in general. So I'm being whacked, from the left and from the right. The right is whacking me on my head, but you are this multicultural. Yeah, it's evil, it's bad. And the left is saying, oh, but you're criticizing what we are currently implementing in Germany, so you must be a Nazi. And I say, well, and so yeah, right wing is really using this, but the left wing is using this, and from the other side. The last thing about this is transport related. Directives. Yes, I mean, in some cases, mechanism of you are just forwarding, national interest, and this is precisely the case. Last thing, I'm sorry. What was the positive impact of the eastern part to the west? I think, first of all, the ability to organize themselves when the European institution cannot deliver. A good example is the 3 Cs initiative by Poland, Croatia, Romania that created the intra-EU project, right? The second thing is showing that the eastern part of EU was basically Europe, all the time. So it is like, the problem is the language of I can experience that as a person who is this Eastern European perspective, but I'm speaking in Western European countries. Sometimes the stuff that I'm saying is like, well, sorry, we even don't understand your basic terms. I mean, so I think that the song of the future is this harmonizing both perspectives. I mean, it's still the way forward. It's still not done. This is why we're having this kind of conversation right now.
I would maybe just like to comment on those questions regarding the specific EU policies, on the question whether the Central Europe has the language to communicate its problems to the EU institutions. I don't think it's a problem of language. The arguments are there; they are communicated. Well, in the first case, in the case of dual quality of foods. Well, I would say, sure, there will always be some kind of loophole that will create problems. But unless you want to regulate the markets and the producers in a very strict way on what they can and cannot produce, there will always be some room for this practice. I would say, but the European institutions are trying. Maybe the regulation still can be improved in the next cycle and in the European Parliament. Probably, but it definitely is trying, and in this respect, I think the European institutions were responsive. What is true, that they were responsive after a very long time, because this is the problem that was first somehow noticed and named in 2011, and we are in 2019, so yes, it was a very belated reaction, so you can definitely argue that. When it comes to posted workers directive, yes, it was a very contentious regulation. Actually, that Slovakia in the end supported a compromise, which was a compromise still more or less along the lines that was proposed, was part of this pro-European U-turn, you would say. And we are now trying to somehow check something out of it as well. But it's a little bit tricky also in the details maybe, because, well, it's true that it will disadvantage Slovak transporters, the transporters from the region. Definitely, what they also were trying to gain with the regulation was there were these shell companies from the Western Europe having being shell companies based in Slovakia, Czech Republic, you name it, and somehow disrupting the competition on the market as well. So it was also something to be considered. In the end, not saying what's right or wrong here, but it's definitely a political decision. Going either in a way of social democracy, fight against social dumping, or in a way of having as much liberal common market as possible. The decision is political.
I completely agree with what has just been said, that this is a big question and dilemma for the future of Europe, whether to go for social solidarity emerging at the supranational level in the spirit of social democracy, or whether we believe, like Marxists believed, that revolution will sort out everything. I say neoliberals are the last Marxists, because they believe that the market will sort out everything. Yeah? And I think this struggle is in waiting in Europe. It's already happening. And but going back to your question about the citizenship, this is actually European dream, yeah, that we are citizens not just of our nation states, we're not speaking just our mother tongue, our native language. We can communicate across the borders, whether they are cultural, geographical, or any, economic and other. And in this respect, Europe failed many times, not just Kosovo. Look at Turkey, and instead of having decent policies from the very beginning, there was a false promise of full membership, so heavily supported by the UK in the past, because once you have the Turkey in, you can forget about not just federalism, but any closer form of integration. Yeah? And so Turkey was being used and promised many decades, actually, to become full member. And this failure then threatens destabilization of neighborhood. And I think European Union has to think carefully about rights and citizenship for Europe, and very sensible policies for associated treaties of association, and basically neighborhood geopolitics to other countries. When it comes to multiculturalism, I'm always fascinated how critics of multiculturalism don't realize that they are part of it. Yes, so when you have these if you live in London, what else but multiculturalism do you encounter at every level, at every corner? The question is what you do with it, how you shape it politically, and Europe cannot be but multicultural. Yeah, we have in varietate concordia, and so unity in diversity. The question is whether you want to make multiculturalism an official ideology like in Canada, constitutional ideology like in Canada, or whether you want it basically to evolve spontaneously in Europe so that cultural differences Central Europe, this is actually a legacy of Central Europe. Central Europe is the legacy of multiculturalism because Vienna was always attracting all sorts of peoples from all around the Habsburg Empire and Middle Europa. So maybe this is something that actually Central Europe can offer, this added value question. I liked it, and EU policies we heard about. I think Zuzana covered it so well, and I'm actually, if I can express some patriotic pride here, I think that the Czech commissioner Věra Jourová actually did a great deal in these policies and basically making companies accountable for the way they make food and for the way they behave differently in East and West, or I should say old member states, new member states. And this brings me to this final reflection on added value, contribution of, to the European discourse. We heard about normalization risks, warnings against normalization that are permeating not just authoritarian but also democratic societies. But as early as 1994, and this was Europe in ascendancy. Yeah, everybody wanted to be member, and European Union itself wanted to emerge as federal statehood. And Václav Havel came to Strasbourg and delivered a speech on European federalism. And the speech was then criticized for being utopian, pro-federalist, and I don't know what else, but it had one big message. If you want to move forward, or if you want to move anywhere, you have to reform and adjust political institutions. You cannot work just through ad hoc policies. You cannot rely just on cultural values and of we Europeans, but you have to work hard and adjust institutions to the imaginaries that you are shaping and that you are following. This is the legacy of Central Europe that the European Union today can, after 25 years, yes, it is 25 years from the speech. After 25 years, we still can learn that if you don't reform your political institutions, you're heading for a nasty crisis.
Well, let's thank our panelists, Jiří, Zuzana, and Grzegorz, one more time and go to our coffee break.